imagine this picture. A student. His name's Chu. He's in Taiwan.
Okay.
He spent a whole year getting ready. He's actually deferred his hospital residency, paid thousands for a master's at Harvard.
Wow. Big commitment.
Huge. His dream is basically set. Or, that's what he thought. Now uncertainty. Yeah. Is he even going to be able to start the program?
Yeah, that story about Chu, it's from one of the news sources we looked at, and it really brings home the human side of all this. It kind of highlights the whole backdrop, doesn't it? A place like Harvard, massive international student population, and they're facing these specific demands that included reports on these students.
And the reaction from, the big players in international education. Pretty sharp, right?
Oh, definitely. NAFSA's CEO, Fanta Aw, is quoted directly. She called this kind of thing unprecedented overreach.
Strong words.
Very. And the message was clear. Students, they shouldn't be bargaining chips. Exactly. And look, this isn't just about one student, Chu, or even just one university. This kind of individual uncertainty, this policy tension, it's all part of a much bigger, much more complex picture when we talk about international students globally.
It really is. It touches on economics, cultural exchange, national interest, and maybe most importantly, how the public actually perceives it all.
Precisely.
And that complex picture, that's exactly what we're diving into today. We've pulled together quite a stack of fascinating sources for this deep dive.
We really have. Reports from key organizations, folks like the American Council on Education, the British Council, Campus France, DIAD in Germany, Unitalia, NUFIC in the Netherlands, SEVP in Spain, plus those news excerpts you mentioned.
Yeah, quite the collection.
And these reports, they bring together just a wealth of information. We've got survey data showing public attitudes, really detailed economic analyses from countries across Europe and the U.S., and, real-world examples of how governments and universities are trying to navigate this whole space.
So, okay, our mission today is pretty clear. We want to unpack what these sources are telling us about the multifaceted impact of international students.
Mm-hmm.
We want to understand their contributions, the public's views, both the positive and, let's face it, the more complicated ones. The policies shaping their journeys and what all this means. For countries around the world, and frankly for you listening, trying to navigate this increasingly interconnected world.
Ugh, that's good.
Let's unpack this, starting with the U.S. picture.
Okay. So drawing heavily from that American Council on Education report, the ACE report, mostly based on their February 2021 survey data,
right,
we get a really detailed snapshot of how the U.S. public sees international students.
And what's the main takeaway?
Well, the overwhelming finding, really, is that there's this broad recognition of the significant value they bring. People generally get it.
That's one of the things that really jumped out at me, too. They're seen not just as, temporary students, but as vital members of communities.
Right. On campus, locally, nationally, even globally.
Academically, for instance, a clear majority, 58%, agree they bring intellectual talent and energy.
Yeah, and it's not just about them. It's about the impact on domestic students, too. 68% see the benefit of having close contact with international peers.
And that number's actually gone up since 2017.
Which is interesting. It suggests people see it's not just about filling seats, but really enriching the whole educational experience.
Exactly. And beyond the campus.
Well, the public connects them to broader benefits, too. Around two-thirds, 64%, agree that having these students promotes international goodwill. Diplomacy, basically.
And science and research.
Which also seen as really important. Nearly 60% recognize their crucial role in generating knowledge. The source even gives examples like, contributing to new vaccines and cures.
Right. And then, of course, there's the economic piece. That always comes up.
Always. And 56%, so over half, agree that international students contribute significantly to the U.S. economy just through their spending while they're studying.
Yeah, the source mentioned that $44 billion figure from 2019. It's a concrete example of that spending impact.
So you see this acknowledged value across multiple fronts: academic, diplomatic, scientific, economic.
But there's always a but, isn't there?
Yeah. As the report notes, it's a nuanced picture. There are also areas of pretty significant public concern and these perceptions of competition.
Right. This is where it gets, more complicated.
Yeah.
Even while people see the benefits, 43%, that's a big chunk, still believe international students take seats from qualified U.S. students.
Yeah, that feeling of direct competition is definitely there for a lot of people.
And security. That seems to be another major area of unease.
It is. 37% believe international students aren't properly vetted. And linked to that, confidence in the State Department's vetting process itself is only around 50%.
Not exactly a ringing endorsement.
Not at all. And that same percentage, 37%, also believe that many international students don't stick to their visa timelines, that they end up overstaying.
Then you layer on the concerns about, like, foreign influence and intellectual property theft.
Right. 41% believe some students are actually sent here specifically to steal valuable U.S. intellectual property.
Wow.
And the source points out this concern gets even stronger when you specifically mention China. Nearly 1 in 2 Americans see IP theft as a widespread problem in that specific context.
The report even mentioned some Pew data, didn't it? About limiting Chinese students.
It did. 55% of Americans supporting limiting the number of Chinese students studying in the U.S. So specific anxieties tied to specific countries.
So when the survey actually asked people, okay, what's the most important reason for your skepticism, what came out on top?
It was interesting. It wasn't just security, though that was there. The top reason at 20% was the idea they go back home and compete with the U.S. economy.
So economic competition again.
Right. Then security threat was 13%, taking seats from U.S. students was 12%, and intellectual property theft was 11%. So it's really a mix of these economic and security worries.
Which, I guess, brings us to a really interesting point in the report. How does the public feel about these students staying after they graduate?
Yeah, and this is where the picture kind of shifts a bit. It's quite revealing.
How so?
Well, while the public isn't necessarily clamoring for just more international students overall, there's actually stronger support for retaining the talent that's already here.
Okay.
61% agree that international students should have the opportunity, through legal channels, to stay and work in the U.S. after they finish their degrees.
So keep the ones who are already educated here.
Exactly. And that support gets even stronger for those in critical fields. 52%, over half, favor making it easier specifically for students with advanced STEM degrees to stay.
And the reasons people give for that support, do they line up with the benefits we talked about earlier?
Perfectly. People clearly see the value in keeping skilled workers here. 55% agree it would enhance the U.S. workforce, especially in areas like tech and STEM, and ultimately boost the economy.
Makes sense.
And the pandemic seems to have kind of reinforced this idea for many people. 60% felt that, given the post-COVID challenges, it's even more important to have a highly skilled workforce, and international grads can help fill that need.
They also value them as potential professors, right?
Yeah, that was high, too. 61% agree they're valuable additions to university faculties, future educators contributing back.
Okay, so you've got this mix. Recognition of value, especially long-term value if they stay, but also these persistent concerns about competition and security. What does the ACE report suggest doing about this for universities, for policymakers? It can't just be about recruitment number, can it?
No, definitely not. The report argues pretty strongly, actually, that a narrative focused only on increasing enrollment or just talking about tuition revenue is, insufficient and potentially counterproductive in the long run.
Because the public values more than just that.
Exactly. The public values the quality these students bring and their long-term potential contributions.
So it calls for a different story. An expanded narrative, I think, was the phrase used.
That's it. One that really highlights the broader contributions, the academic energy, the cultural enrichment, the scientific breakthroughs, the diplomatic connections, and their potential as future contributors to the workforce and global ties. It's a much bigger picture.
And what about concrete policy actions?
Well, the source mentions several ideas, things like prioritizing and streamlining visa processing, maybe offering more flexibility on things like in-person interviews.
Okay.
Also addressing that tricky concept of non-immigrant intent.
Your requirement for temporary visitors like students to prove they don't plan to stay permanently.
Right, which gets complicated if you actually do want them to stay and work after graduating. And related to that, making the green card process smoother for those with advanced degrees, especially in STEM.
And what about the universities themselves? What's the message for them?
It's pretty clear, move beyond just recruitment. The focus needs to shift towards prioritizing real inclusion, meaning dedicating resources, creating genuine opportunities for cross-cultural learning on campus, making sure international students feel supported and integrated throughout their entire time, not just during the application process.
So it's about shifting the focus from just getting students in the door
to ensuring they actually thrive and that their presence truly benefits the entire campus and the wider community in all those ways the public seems to value.
That makes a lot of sense. It's not just a transaction, it's an investment. Okay, let's broaden our view now. How do these kinds of trends and impacts play out globally? Let's draw on some of those other reports, maybe starting with Italia and others from Europe.
Yeah, absolutely. And if we connect this U.S. picture to what's happening in other countries, one of the most consistent findings across the board is just the sheer economic power that international students represent. It's huge everywhere.
Right. We mentioned the U.S. figure from NAFSA, over $33 billion, supporting, over 335,000 jobs back in 2021-22?
Yeah, and they even have a formula for calculating that, basically looking at student spending minus any U.S. support, plus what their dependents spend.
But look at the UK. According to the British Council report, their contribution is even larger, almost 42 billion pounds in 2021-22. That's massive.
It really is. And what stands out there is how widespread the impact is. It's not just London. It averages out to tens of millions per parliamentary constituency, hundreds of pounds per citizen, effectively.
Wow, that really brings it home. They also mentioned how Brexit affected things for EU students' fees, right?
They did. A significant policy shift impacting flows there. Then you look at France. Campus France calculates a total contribution of $5 billion.
Still a huge number.
Definitely. And they estimate a net direct impact of over $1.3 billion after you account for costs. Their data also gives us a little peek into student life economics.
Like how they fund their studies.
Yeah, family support is dominant, but also savings, some aid, maybe part-time jobs, and where the money goes. Rent is the biggest chunk, almost half their spending. Then daily living costs.
And they contribute in other ways, too, besides tuition.
Oh, yeah. Visitor spending when family comes, transport, language training fees, even Social Security contributions if they work. It all adds up.
Even in smaller countries, the impact seems significant relative to their size. Estonia, for instance.
Right. Their agency, Harno, reported a contribution over $55 million. But what's really fascinating in Estonia is the sharp increase in tax contributions from international students and graduates who stay and work.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it more than doubled in just a couple of years, especially driven by those working in the ICT sector. So you see that direct return to the public purse.
And Finland?
Finland's agency, EDUII, estimated a net value of $81 million for the public economy. They do note the average cost per student for institutions, but studies they cite suggest that bringing in young, educated adults this way could have a really significant potential net benefit for the public finances long term. Hundreds of thousands of euros per person, potentially.
And that Italia report, what specifics did it give us about Italy?
It gives some interesting demographic details. Students often coming from Asia, frequently studying at the master's level. It also highlighted their economic sensitivity.
Meaning they're careful with money.
Yeah, mentioning things like cooking at home more, spending less on leisure activities. It also noted how important scholarships are. Many rely on regional funding, and like elsewhere, rent is their biggest expense.
So beyond that initial spending boost while they're students, a lot of these sources also look at the longer-term economic impact through the workforce, right?
Absolutely. This is where those stay rates become really important.
Okay. What did the reports find there?
Well, Estonia, again, reports that over half their international students actually work while studying. And crucially, really high percentages of master's and doctoral graduates stay and work in Estonia a year later. Over 70% for master's grads, over 60% for PhDs. That's significant integration.
Wow, those are high numbers. What about Finland?
Finland's data showed a stay rate around 46% employed a year after graduating, looking at a cohort from 2011. They noted some slight improvement in later data, too, so maybe not as high as Estonia, but still substantial.
And Germany. They're a major destination now.
Huge. Now, the third most popular globally, apparently. And interestingly, India has recently overtaken China as the #1 source country for them.
Okay.
And Germany explicitly sees these international students as, quote, ideal immigrants to help tackle their skilled labor shortages. Their agency, DA, is actively working not just on attracting students, but on integrating them into the labor market afterwards.
What about the Netherlands?
NUFIC, their organization, reports a pretty stable stay rate. About a quarter of students are still there 5 years after graduating. And of those who stay, the vast majority, 3/4, are employed.
Any difference between students from within Europe versus outside?
Yeah, interestingly, non-EA students have a much higher stay rate, 38%, compared to those from within the EEA, which was only 19%.
Why might that be?
The report mentions factors like housing shortages and language barriers as challenges to staying for everyone, but perhaps the incentives or opportunities differ. It also notes the average salary for those who stay is pretty decent, around $46,000.
Or back in the UK.
The British Council report includes the economic contribution of those who stay and work in their overall $42 billion figure. They definitely see them as enhancing the workforce.
So the economic story, both short-term and long-term, is clearly massive across all these countries. But the sources also talked about broader impacts, right? Things that are maybe harder to put a number on.
Absolutely. You can't just measure this in dollars or euros or pounds. Multiple sources, like the UK and Estonia reports, really highlight the cultural and intellectual diversity that international students bring, how they enrich the learning environment for everyone on campus and in the wider community.
And the potential for future connections.
Definitely. The UK, Estonia, Finland sources all point to that. The potential for long-term business links, investment opportunities, trade connections that get forged because someone studied abroad years earlier.
That makes sense. Building bridges.
And then there's that whole element of soft diplomatic power.
Yeah.
The UK, Finland, France reports all talk about how these students essentially become ambassadors for the host country when they go back home or wherever they go next.
I remember the French data specifically mentioned how likely former students were to recommend France for things like tourism or business.
Exactly. That long-term positive impression is really valuable, though hard to quantify precisely.
We also saw the role of these national agencies, SEVP in Spain, Campus France, DID, NUFIC, etc. They're not just passively collecting data.
Not at all. They're actively working to promote their country's higher education system internationally and also crucial in providing support structures for students once they actually arrive. They play a really key role in this whole ecosystem.
But it's not all straightforwardly positive, is it? Some reports mentioned complexities.
Right. It's important to have a balanced view. The Finland source, for instance, acknowledged potential downsides or complexities to consider, like could there be competition for certain jobs? What are the effects on local students? So while the overall benefits are seen as significant, it's not without factors that need careful management.
And the Spanish agency, SEPI, mentioned something about social benefits.
Yeah, they specifically noted that getting the public to fully recognize the broader social benefits of international education, beyond just the economics, is still kind of an ongoing conversation. It takes work to build that wider understanding.
Okay, so let's try and wrap this up. To recap this deep dive into all these sources, what have we really seen?
Well, I think it's undeniable that international students are incredibly significant economic contributors right across the globe. That comes through loud and clear.
Definitely. They also enrich campuses academically, culturally.
Yeah, fostering exchange. And generally, the public seems to view them positively for these contributions, especially their potential to become skilled workers and global connectors if they stay after graduation. That long-term view is valued.
However,
the sources also consistently show that public concerns around things like security and competition for seats or maybe jobs, those are real. They persist and they need to be acknowledged and addressed.
and the takeaway for institutions and policymakers seems to be
That just focusing on recruitment numbers, on the tuition fees, it isn't enough. There needs to be a genuine commitment to really supporting and integrating these students throughout their journey. That's how you realize the full spectrum of benefits that everyone seems to recognize is possible.
So this whole exploration of the sources, it really paints a picture of international student mobility as this incredibly dynamic, complex, global thing.
Absolutely. With really profound consequences for the individuals involved, for the universities, for national autonomies, and for international relations.
And it really highlights that ongoing tension, doesn't it? Between the desire to welcome global talent and the need to address legitimate national concerns.
Exactly. And building on that tension and, thinking about the source's emphasis on that long-term value and the need for these expanded narratives, here's maybe something provocative to consider.
Yeah.
If the public, as the data suggests, generally recognizes the significant long-term value of international students staying and contributing to the workforce and society, how can countries effectively bridge that gap, the gap between recognizing the value and those persistent concerns about security and competition? How can policies and practices truly reflect all those multifaceted benefits in a way that builds and maintains public trust in our increasingly interconnected world? What stands out to you from all this?